Mafia boss checked his old house cameras furious, froze to see his ex asleep. With a newborn, the night stretched endlessly across the horizon as Dante Romano's black Maserati roared down the lonely coastal road, its headlights slicing through sheets of rain that shimmered like broken glass against the asphalt. 3 years had passed since he last set foot in the city that once whispered his name in fear and respect. 3 years since he had walked away from the throne of blood and gold that bore his family's crest. The empire he built with fire and fury still existed in shadows, ruled by men who owed him everything, but Dante had long stopped caring about power. Power had taken everything from him, his peace, his soul, and the only woman who had ever mattered. Tonight, as thunder rumbled in the distance, he wasn't the feared Romano boss returning to reclaim what was his. He was a ghost chasing echoes of the past, a man haunted by the memory of a voice he could still hear in his sleep. The towering silhouette of his old mansion emerged through the fog, its marble pillars cracked, its iron gates half swallowed by ivy. It had once been the crown jewel of the Romano estate, a fortress of opulence where laughter once echoed, where Isabella's heels once clicked against the marble floors. He parked in the gravel driveway, the sound of the rain dulling as he stepped out, his long coat absorbing the storm. The mansion looked alive in the dark, not through light, but through memory. Every brick, every window seemed to breathe with ghosts, watching him return with silent accusation. Dante's hand brushed against the cold brass door handle, and for the first time in years, his pulse raced not from fear but from something heavier, regret. When the door creaked open, dust and silence greeted him like old friends. The scent of wood polish, faint perfume, and time greeted him all at once, pulling his chest tight. The chandeliers above were draped in cobwebs, their crystals dull. But the grand piano still sat in the corner where Isabella once played, her laughter filling the air as she teased him for pretending not to enjoy her music. He had burned that sound from his memory, but standing there now, he could almost hear it again. Dante's boots echoed as he walked toward his office, the heart of the mansion, a room that had seen both business and betrayal. He poured himself a drink from the dusty decanter, the amber liquid trembling slightly as thunder cracked outside. He sat in his old leather chair, staring at the wall of monitors built into the mahogany shelves. He had forgotten about the mansion's security system, the one he'd installed years ago after the ambush that changed everything. He hesitated, then reached out, brushing his fingers against the control panel. The screens flickered to life one by one, static at first, then faint, ghostly images. He expected emptiness. Cobwebs. Shadows. But on one of the feeds, the living room camera, movement caught his eye. His brow furrowed. He leaned forward, his glass forgotten, heart hammering in his chest. The footage was live, not recorded. Someone was inside his house. He turned up the feed, the static clearing into clarity, and what he saw made his world tilt on its axis. A woman lay curled on his old leather couch, wrapped in a blanket, her hair tangled and wet as though she'd come in from the storm. The room around her looked untouched, except for the faint flicker of a candle burning low beside her. His mind scrambled to make sense of it. A thief? A squatter? But then she shifted slightly in her sleep, and something small stirred beside her, a baby. A tiny, fragile form tucked in her arms, sleeping peacefully against her chest. Dante's breath caught. The camera zoomed in slightly as he adjusted the controls with trembling fingers. Her face tilted into view, soft in the candlelight, and time itself seemed to stop. The air left his lungs. His chest tightened so sharply that he felt his pulse in his throat. Isabella. Her name ripped through him like a blade. His body went cold, the warmth draining from his fingers as the realization hit. She looked exactly as she did in his dreams, tired, beautiful, heartbreakingly alive. But she couldn't be. He had buried her memory, mourned her death, stood over the wreckage of the car that burned the night his empire crumbled. The storm outside raged harder as Dante's cigarette slipped from his fingers, falling soundlessly onto the marble floor. He leaned closer to the monitor, every rational thought vanishing. The baby shifted, a soft hand escaping the blanket, and for the briefest second, Dante saw something impossible, eyes shaped like his, even through the blur of the screen. His throat constricted. He blinked, disbelief and grief twisting inside him like barbed wire. No. It can't be her, he whispered, voice hoarse, almost afraid of hearing his own words. The room around him felt suddenly smaller, colder, as if the walls themselves were listening. He reached for the volume control, trying to catch any sound through the audio feed, a breath, a sigh, anything to prove she was real. But before he could, the image flickered violently. The feed glitched, a flash of static, a shadow behind her, then total darkness. Every screen went black. Dante sat frozen in the chair, his hand still hovering over the panel, the hum of the monitors replaced by the pounding of his own heartbeat. The silence was deafening, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you forget to breathe. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand, but his legs felt unsteady. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, but another voice, one softer, buried deep inside, whispered that maybe, just maybe, life had brought her back. Outside, lightning illuminated the mansion's facade, making it look alive again, as if the house itself had waited for this moment. Dante turned toward the dark hallway that led to the living room, his mind a storm of disbelief and longing. He didn't know whether he was walking toward a ghost, a dream, or the cruelest truth of all. But one thing was certain, the mansion that had been dead for 3 years was breathing again. The silence inside the mansion felt like it could shatter with a single heartbeat as Dante stood motionless in the dim corridor, every breath shallow, his senses sharpened by disbelief. The air tasted of dust and rain. The faint echo of the thunder outside seemed to merge with the blood rushing in his ears. He pressed his palm against the wall, feeling the cold marble beneath his glove, grounding himself against the dizzying flood of memory and confusion. For 3 years he had trained himself to forget her voice, to bury her image beneath layers of power, violence, and numbness, but the glimpse of her face on that flickering screen had undone it all. The mansion that once held his pride now pulsed with a strange, electric anticipation, as though it too recognized the return of something long thought gone. He moved toward the staircase, boots heavy against the stone, each step slow, deliberate, drawn forward by equal parts dread and hope. Shadows leapt across the walls with every flash of lightning, and for a moment he thought he saw her silhouette reflected in the tall mirrors, her laughter echoing faintly through his mind. He clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened, forcing the ghosts away. He had to know the truth, whether the image had been real, whether Isabella truly breathed beneath his roof, or whether grief had finally twisted itself into illusion. At the top of the stairs he paused, listening. Somewhere below, a floorboard creaked. He reached for the pistol holstered beneath his coat, the habit of an old life returning as easily as breathing. The weapon's weight steadied him. Its cold steel was familiar, unlike the storm of emotion clawing through his chest. He flicked the safety off and descended, one careful step after another, eyes scanning every dark corner. The mansion responded to him like an old enemy, groaning and sighing with each gust of wind. In the vast living room ahead, the faint orange glow of a candle trembled through the half-open door. He stopped just outside it, every muscle locked. The air smelled faintly of milk and lavender, a scent that made his heart stumble, because it was hers. He pushed the door open an inch and peered through. There she was. Isabella, curled on the couch exactly as the camera had shown her, her face softened by exhaustion, strands of damp hair clinging to her cheek. The small bundle in her arms moved slightly, a baby's whimper rising and fading into the rhythm of her breathing. Dante's chest tightened so violently it hurt. For a long moment he could only stand there, torn between running to her and fleeing from the truth. He had buried that truth once, with his own hands, beneath the ashes of the life they had shared. Yet here she was, impossibly alive, fragile, beautiful, real. He took one silent step inside, his boots barely whispering against the floor. The candlelight trembled as if it sensed him. He stopped just a few feet away, staring at the child. Tiny fingers peeked out from the blanket, curling and uncurling as if reaching for something unseen. The sound of rain softened. The mansion seemed to hold its breath. Dante's own breathing grew shallow, uneven. He had seen death countless times, he had delivered it himself, but nothing in his life had ever struck him as deeply as this quiet, living miracle that should not exist. He wanted to speak, to call her name, but the word refused to leave his lips. Instead, he set the pistol on the table beside him and sank slowly into the armchair opposite her, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of her shoulders. Minutes passed like hours. A log in the fireplace cracked, scattering sparks that glowed and dimmed. Isabella stirred faintly, a small sigh escaping her as she tightened her hold on the child. The sound sliced through him like a blade. Every emotion he had locked away, guilt, anger, longing, love, came flooding back in violent waves. He remembered the last night he saw her, the way she'd begged him to leave the war between the families behind, to choose peace over pride. He had refused, blinded by vengeance, and hours later everything had burned. He closed his eyes, pressing his fingertips against his temple, trying to steady his thoughts. Maybe this was punishment, he thought, to see her alive but unreachable, to face what he had destroyed. The thunder cracked again, a sharp reminder of the world beyond their fragile silence. He opened his eyes and looked at her once more. Something inside him shifted, a fragile hope forming where none had lived for years. He leaned forward slightly, the chair creaking beneath him, and the sound caused her to stir again. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes trembling, and then her eyes opened. For a heartbeat they were unfocused, lost between dream and reality. Then they found him. The candlelight reflected in her gaze, widening with shock, disbelief, maybe even fear. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Dante didn't move. He could see every emotion ripple through her, the confusion, the pain, the raw astonishment. Time stretched thin between them. Finally, he whispered, barely audible, "Isabella." The name hung in the air like a secret the house had been waiting to hear again. Her breath caught. She clutched the baby closer, as if protecting it from a ghost. For an instant he thought she would scream, but instead a tear slipped down her cheek, glistening in the trembling light. The baby stirred again, letting out a soft cry that filled the silence between them. Dante felt the sound pierce straight through his armor, unraveling every wall he had ever built. He wanted to speak, to ask 100 questions, but his throat closed around them. The only thing he could manage was a quiet, disbelieving whisper, "How?" She looked at him for a long moment, eyes wide and glistening, but said nothing. The candle flickered violently, then steadied, casting their shadows together on the wall like a cruel memory of the life they once shared. Outside, the wind howled through the broken shutters, and somewhere deep in the house, a door slammed shut, echoing through the halls like a warning. For a long moment neither of them moved. The storm outside was the only sound, a deep and restless pulse that filled the spaces between their shallow breaths. Dante's body felt heavy with everything unsaid, every ghost that had followed him here, yet his mind was sharp, pulled taut by the shock of seeing her alive. Isabella's eyes darted from him to the doorway as if searching for an escape, her arms tightening around the baby. The candlelight carved fragile lines across her face, and Dante saw that fear had replaced the warmth he once knew. He took one slow step forward, his boots whispering against the floor. "You're real," he murmured, his voice raw, disbelieving. She flinched as though the words themselves could hurt her. "Stay away, Dante," she said softly, her tone trembling but firm, and it cut through him like a blade. "You don't belong here anymore." He stopped, the words echoing in the hollow space between them. The last time they had spoken, she'd been begging him to leave this life behind. Now, 3 years later, she was saying the same thing, but with a different kind of desperation, one laced with fear. He could barely breathe. "I buried you," he said, voice tightening as anger rose to mask the ache inside him. "I saw your car explode on the bridge. I stood there, Isabella." The sound of her name coming from his lips made her eyes glisten. Tears gathered but didn't fall. Her jaw trembled as she shook her head. "You weren't supposed to find me," she whispered, her voice so fragile it nearly broke him. "You were never supposed to find out the truth." Dante's pulse hammered against his temples. "What truth?" he demanded, his tone low but trembling, filled with an edge that came from equal parts heartbreak and fury. She hesitated, her lips parting, but before a single word could leave her, the sharp crack of glass tore through the silence. The window beside the crib exploded inward, shards flying like silver rain. Instinct overrode thought. Dante lunged forward, wrapping himself around Isabella and the child, pulling them both to the floor as splinters and dust filled the air. The bullet buried itself into the wall inches from the crib, the sound of impact echoing through the mansion like thunder. The baby cried out, its small voice piercing through the chaos, and Isabella clutched the child tightly, trembling. Dante's breath came hard. He pressed his back against the couch, his mind already calculating angle, trajectory, distance. Whoever had fired that shot had known exactly where to aim. He turned his head toward the shattered window, rain dripping through the broken glass, wind howling like a warning. "Someone's outside," he muttered. Isabella's eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. "They found me," she whispered, her words barely audible but soaked in dread. "I told you, Dante, you shouldn't have come back." He didn't respond. His instincts had already taken over. He grabbed the pistol from the table where he had left it earlier, checking the chamber with practiced precision. The candle had gone out during the blast, leaving them in semi-darkness lit only by the flashes of lightning outside. Dante's figure looked carved from shadow, silent, lethal, controlled. He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze again, and in that fleeting second, he saw how terrified she was, not just for herself, but for the child. He had questions clawing inside him, questions that burned, but there would be no answers if they didn't survive the next minute. He nodded toward the hallway. "Stay down. Don't move." Isabella shook her head, gripping his sleeve with trembling fingers. "You can't fight them, Dante. They're not after you." He froze. The words struck him like a jolt of electricity. "Then who?" he asked quietly, his voice low, deadly. She hesitated again, and for a heartbeat he saw something flicker behind her eyes, guilt. But before she could speak, another bullet smashed through the window frame, embedding itself into the opposite wall. Dante ducked instinctively, covering her again, his arms shielding the baby as debris rained down around them. The infant wailed louder, its cries echoing through the hall, and somewhere beyond the storm, Dante heard footsteps crunching against gravel. He knew that sound, trained killers, moving fast, closing in. He reached for the nearby curtain and ripped it down, wrapping it quickly around the shattered frame to block the view from outside. Then he turned back to Isabella, his voice steady but edged with command. "You're going to tell me what's happening, but not here. We need to move." She looked at him, her lips trembling. "I told you, Dante," she whispered again, her voice breaking this time. "You were never supposed to find me." He stared at her, fury and confusion twisting inside him, but there was no time to demand answers. The next flash of lightning revealed movement outside, a shadow slipping across the rain. Dante's body tensed, every instinct from his past life roaring awake. The beast he'd buried had just risen again. He checked the magazine, slid it back with a click, and turned off the safety. "They came to the wrong house," he muttered under his breath. He rose slowly, his eyes never leaving the window, the glow of lightning painting his face in brief flashes of white and gray. Behind him, Isabella rocked the baby gently, whispering soft, desperate words to calm it, though her own hands shook uncontrollably. The mansion groaned as the wind pressed against its walls, every sound amplified by the storm, the ticking of the clock, the creak of the floors, the baby's uneven breaths. Dante moved toward the doorway, steps silent, controlled, like the predator he used to be. When he reached the edge of the room, he turned back one last time, his eyes locking on hers. "You're going to survive this," he said quietly. "Both of you." She didn't answer, but he could see the terror mingled with trust in her eyes, the same trust she once had years ago before everything fell apart. Another gust of wind burst through the house, scattering dust. And Dante disappeared into the corridor like a shadow returning to the darkness that made him. The crack of the gunshot still rang through the mansion, echoing off marble and memory, when Dante's instincts slammed into motion. He lunged forward, dragging Isabella and the baby behind the old oak pillar just as splinters rained down like sparks from hell, his pulse a wild drum in his chest. "Down," he hissed, pressing her head close to his chest while his eyes scanned the moonlit windows for movement. the security cameras still flickering silently above them, useless ghosts of technology. The smell of gunpowder mixed with her perfume, jasmine and fear, and it hit him harder than the danger itself. 3 years of denial, 3 years of thinking she was dust in an unmarked grave, and now she was breathing, shaking, warm beneath his arms. Another bullet cracked, shattering the chandelier, crystals raining over the baby's muffled whimper, and Dante's rage ignited, raw, unfiltered, protective. He crawled toward the fallen shelf, his hand finding the pistol holstered at his ankle, that old familiar weight that had once made him king and monster all at once. "Who's out there?" he growled under his breath, eyes narrowing at the shadows beyond the curtains that moved just slightly too slow, too deliberate. The storm outside roared, thunder drowning the next whisper of glass breaking, and Isabella's hand caught his sleeve. "Don't go out there," she begged, voice trembling, her eyes wide with something deeper than fear. It was guilt. "They'll kill you too." He stared at her, the words a cold hook in his gut. "Who?" he demanded, barely keeping his voice low. "Who the hell knows you're alive?" She shook her head, tears streaking down her face, her fingers tightening around the infant. "Please, Dante, you have to trust me." "Trust?" he snapped, keeping his voice under control but his heart in pieces. "You died, Isabella. I buried you with my own hands. I built an empire on your grave." The baby whimpered again, and her voice cracked. "That's why they'll never stop. Because you were never supposed to see us again." Dante froze. The words "us" and "never supposed" tangled in his head, forming questions he wasn't ready to face. He peered around the pillar. The front gate was ajar, swaying in the wind, rain slicing through the open doorway where muddy footprints led back into the dark. Whoever fired those shots was gone, but the message was clear: this wasn't random. Someone had been watching the same cameras he had, someone who wanted him to find her. He slid the pistol onto the table, running a hand over his face as Isabella rocked the baby slowly, whispering lullabies that sounded like old confessions. His mind raced: names, enemies, ghosts. Every rival he'd ever buried had family. Every deal he'd ever broken had left a scar. But none of them would know her name. Not unless she'd told them. "You owe me the truth," he said finally, his voice low, shaking not from fear but from the weight of the past clawing back. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering with tears and exhaustion, lips trembling as if words themselves might break her. "I didn't die in that car," she said softly. "They made me disappear." The phrase hung in the air like a curse, the baby's soft breathing the only sound between them. Dante stepped closer, his anger melting into something far more dangerous: hope. "Who?" he whispered again, barely able to speak. Isabella hesitated, staring into his eyes as if deciding whether he could survive the truth. Lightning flashed, throwing her shadow against the cracked walls where their photographs once hung, faded ghosts of a love that refused to stay buried. "The people who took everything from you," she said finally, voice trembling. "The ones who burned your empire." Dante's eyes widened, every nerve in his body screaming. The storm outside howled louder, the mansion creaking like a living thing, as if the walls themselves remembered the fire that had consumed their past. "They knew you'd come back," she added in a whisper, clutching the baby closer. "That's why they waited." He stared at her, realization dawning like blood spreading through water. He hadn't stumbled into this by accident. He'd been led here, guided by an invisible hand that wanted him to see her, to feel this, to make him vulnerable again. He took a deep breath, fighting the chaos in his chest, forcing his tone steady. "We're leaving," he said finally, and Isabella shook her head. "You can't outrun them." Dante's eyes hardened, that old fire flashing behind them. "Watch me." He moved toward the window, peering into the rain where the shadows seemed to move on their own, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt alive. But deep inside, beneath the fury and confusion, something colder settled, the haunting sense that whoever wanted Isabella dead wasn't done. And the next bullet wouldn't miss. The storm outside had turned into a beast, clawing at the mansion's cracked windows as thunder rolled through the empty halls, but Dante didn't flinch. His hands moved with precision, muscle memory born from years of blood and betrayal. As he guided Isabella and the baby through the narrow hallway toward the hidden passage behind the wine cellar. The one he'd built when power made him paranoid and paranoia kept him alive. The scent of dust and old secrets filled the air as the wall slid open, revealing the steel door to the underground safe room, a room meant for storing gold, now serving as a shelter for ghosts. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice a low growl that barely hid the tremor underneath. Isabella's eyes, glistening in the dim light, followed him like a prayer. "Dante, please," I said. "Stay," he snapped, but softer than before, because her trembling lips and the tiny sound of the baby's breath made something inside him ache worse than any bullet ever could. He handed her his jacket, heavy with his scent and warmth, before turning toward the rack where his weapons lay untouched for years. The sound of metal sliding into place echoed like thunder, his hands loading the gun with the rhythm of a man who'd sworn he'd never need it again. "Who sent them?" he muttered, almost to himself, the words tasting like fire. Isabella hesitated, her voice breaking as she whispered, "It's not your enemies, Dante. It's your brother." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if listening. Dante's hand froze mid-motion, the bullet he was about to load slipping through his fingers and clinking against the floor like a bell tolling for something sacred and broken. He turned slowly, his face drained of color, his eyes hollow yet burning. "Lorenzo?" The name felt like poison on his tongue, a memory he'd buried under the rubble of everything he'd lost. Isabella's tears fell silently as she nodded, clutching the child closer, whispering words that trembled like the candlelight between them. "He said the baby carries your empire's curse." The words cut deeper than any blade. Dante's jaw tightened, every muscle in his body locking as the air around them seemed to thicken with anger, betrayal, and disbelief. "He tried to kill you?" he asked, but it wasn't a question, it was a confession of something darker, a promise. Isabella looked away, unable to meet the storm in his gaze. "He said it was mercy. That no Romano child should be born under your name." Dante took a slow step back, his gun lowering, his heart splintering in silence. He remembered Lorenzo's smile, cold, perfect, deceitful, the smile of a man who had watched his brother build an empire only to inherit its ashes. He'd always known Lorenzo wanted control, but he'd never thought his own blood would turn executioner. The walls felt smaller, the air colder, as Dante's reflection in the metal door stared back at him, a man reborn through grief. "Then he'll learn what hell really is," he whispered, the words rolling out like thunder from the depths of his soul. The candle flickered violently, and Isabella's breath caught as the baby stirred. A faint creak echoed through the ceiling above them, soft, deliberate, wrong. Dante's head shot upward, instinct screaming. He reached for the monitor beside the safe door, flipping the switch to the camera feeds. Static filled the screens before one flickered to life, showing the mansion's main hall bathed in shadow. The front door was wide open again, wind howling through it, rain glistening on the marble. And then, movement. A dark silhouette passing through the hallway, slow, certain, like it knew exactly where to go. "Someone's in the house," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling, clutching the child tighter. Dante's finger hovered over the trigger, but his mind raced. Was it Lorenzo's men, or Lorenzo himself? He leaned closer to the monitor, his heart pounding, his breath shallow. The figure paused at the grand staircase, and even through the static, Dante could see the glint of a weapon. The lights above them flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the safe room into suffocating darkness. Isabella gasped. The baby began to cry, the sound echoing like a heartbeat in the void. Dante reached out, his hand finding Isabella's shoulder in the dark. "Quiet," he murmured, but even his voice trembled now, not from fear but from the awareness that whatever hunted them wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside these walls, breathing with them, listening. The generator should have kicked in. It didn't. That's when Dante realized something far worse. Whoever was here had cut the power manually. They weren't breaking in, they already knew the mansion's secrets. The storm roared louder above, lightning flashing through the cracks around the steel door, and for a single moment, Dante saw his reflection again in Isabella's eyes, haunted, furious, alive. He raised his gun, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "They came for blood," he said. "Let's give them a reason to be afraid of it." Darkness swallowed the room whole, pressing against Dante's senses until even his heartbeat sounded like footsteps. The faint whimper of the baby became a fragile rhythm against the silence, and Isabella's shaky breathing brushed the air like wind through broken glass. Dante's grip on the gun tightened as his eyes tried to adjust, though there was no light left to find. "Stay behind me," he whispered, guiding her backward toward the far corner of the safe room, where the cold metal walls met the floor. He could hear something, footsteps above, slow, heavy, deliberate. Whoever was in the mansion wasn't searching. They were hunting. A memory flashed in his mind, teaching Lorenzo how to move silently through the halls when they were boys, playing hide and seek among the corridors their father built like a fortress. That same rhythm now echoed from above, and Dante's blood turned to ice. He could almost hear his brother's laughter buried beneath the thunder. He crouched low, moving toward the steel door, ear pressed against it, straining to catch anything, breathing, whispers, a click of a safety catch. The storm outside surged, lightning flashing through the thin cracks of the doorframe, giving him brief glimpses of Isabella's terrified face and the infant in her arms. The baby's cry broke the silence again, sharper this time, desperate, and Dante's pulse quickened. "He'll hear us," Isabella mouthed, panic trembling in every syllable. Dante turned to her, his expression softening despite the danger. "He already knows we're here." He pulled open the emergency panel beside the door, a hidden lever that would override the lock and give him access to the narrow stairwell leading to the ground floor. The mechanism hissed as it opened, the sound too loud in the silence. Dante's instincts screamed to move fast. He looked back at Isabella. "Take the baby and wait. No matter what you hear, you don't come out." Her eyes filled with tears. "Don't do this alone." His voice softened to something raw and unfamiliar. "You're the reason I came back from the dead, Isabella. I won't lose you again." Before she could answer, he slipped into the stairwell, the door sealing behind him with a heavy click that left her alone in suffocating dark. The passage smelled of rust and earth, the air thick with the ghosts of years gone by. Dante climbed the steps silently, the pistol ready, his body moving with the precision of a man reborn into violence. Every creak of the floorboards above sounded like a memory of betrayal. When he reached the top, the corridor stretched before him, shadows and faint silver light from the storm filtering through shattered windows. Rain dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the marble, and the smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. He moved like a predator, silent and focused, every nerve alive. In the faint reflection of the glass, he caught a glimpse of movement at the end of the hall, a figure cloaked in black, head tilted as if listening for something. Dante raised his gun, heart hammering, but something about the stance froze him. It wasn't Lorenzo. The silhouette was too lean, too hesitant. He stepped closer, keeping to the shadows, and when lightning flashed again, he saw the face, a young man, no older than 20, fear etched across his features. One of Lorenzo's men, but not the kind that killed for fun. The kid turned suddenly, gun raised, eyes wide. Dante moved first. A single shot cracked through the hall, deafening in the confined space, and the boy fell with a gasp, clutching his shoulder. "Don't move," Dante growled, his voice echoing like thunder. The boy whimpered, blood spreading across the marble. "Please, he said you'd be gone? He said she'd be alone." Dante's breath caught. "Who?" The boy coughed, pain twisting his face. "Lorenzo. He's coming? He wants the child." His voice broke into a sob before his eyes rolled back, and silence reclaimed the hall. Dante stood there, rage boiling under his skin, the name of his brother tasting like ash in his mouth. He knew then that this was no warning, it was an execution delayed. He wiped the blood from his hand, eyes darkening. A crash echoed from the east wing, a door thrown open, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps descending into the cellar. His stomach turned to lead. Isabella. He sprinted through the corridors. Gun drawn, slipping across the wet floor. the walls flashing with lightning as if the house itself were alive again, screaming in protest. When he reached the cellar entrance, the steel door to the safe room was wide open, hanging on one hinge, sparks spitting from the control panel. "Isabella!" he shouted, his voice raw. No answer. The light flickered once, dim and ghostly, revealing the empty room. Only the echo of the baby's distant cry drifted from the darkness beyond. Dante's knees hit the floor, fury and panic colliding inside him like fire and gasoline. He slammed his fist against the wall, the sound echoing through the empty chamber. The storm outside wailed louder, drowning the sound of his grief. He looked up at the shattered monitor. The camera feed still flickering weakly, and through the static, he saw a single image: Isabella running through the back garden, the baby in her arms, and behind her, a shadow moving closer, familiar, relentless. Dante's heart stopped. The shape was unmistakable. The way he moved, the tilt of his head, even the calm precision of his stride. It was Lorenzo. His brother had come home. Rain crashed down on the Romano estate like the heavens themselves had turned against it. Thunder rolling as Dante burst through the shattered back doors. His boots splashing through mud and blood. The storm blinding him with sheets of white light. The garden, once a symbol of everything Isabella loved, was now a battlefield. Statues lay toppled, rose petals scattered like pieces of lost innocence, and somewhere between the thunderclaps, the echo of a woman's desperate cry cut through the night. "Isabella!" he shouted, voice cracking as he sprinted toward the tree line, gun raised, adrenaline drowning the ache in his chest. The silhouette ahead blurred and shifted through the rain, Lorenzo's frame, tall, deliberate, moving like death itself, his coat billowing behind him as lightning carved his face in fragments of light. "Lorenzo!" Dante roared, the sound primal, full of rage and betrayal. His brother turned slightly, his movements slow, controlled, like a man who'd already decided the outcome. A smirk touched his lips before he disappeared into the forest path. Gunfire exploded a second later. Dante dove behind the marble fountain, shards of stone slicing his arm, but he didn't feel the pain. He returned fire, each shot an echo of everything he'd buried, every sin, every lie, every night he'd cursed the blood they shared. The air filled with smoke and thunder. A figure stumbled from the shadows, a man in Lorenzo's colors, and Dante didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man by the collar, slamming him against the statue base, the gun pressed under his chin. "Where is she?" he demanded, voice low and trembling with fury. The man spat blood, laughing weakly. "Your brother doesn't want the throne," he wheezed. "He wants the baby." Dante froze, the words striking deeper than any bullet. The rain fell harder, washing the blood from his hands as his mind spiraled through 100 horrors at once. "What does that mean?" he growled, pressing the gun tighter. The man's smile widened, cracked teeth glinting in the lightning. "It means your empire was never yours to rebuild. It belongs to him now, through your son." Dante's stomach twisted. "My son?" The man's laughter broke into a choking cough, but his eyes burned with cruel amusement. "You didn't even know, did you?" A flash of lightning illuminated his face, and for the first time, Dante saw fear there, not of dying, but of the man standing over him. He squeezed the trigger. The gunshot rang across the garden, cutting through the storm. The man went limp, his laughter dying in the rain. Dante stumbled back, his breathing ragged, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. A child. His child. And Lorenzo had taken him. Rage and despair collided inside him as he turned toward the mansion, sprinting through the shattered doorway, his boots leaving trails of red across the marble floor. The walls seemed to close in around him, whispers of the past chasing him down every hall. He reached the safe room door and slammed it open, his voice breaking. "Isabella!" The echo came back empty. The lights flickered weakly from the emergency generator, illuminating the wreckage, broken furniture, scattered blankets, the faint smell of gunpowder. The cradle was overturned. His pulse hammered as he stepped deeper into the room, every breath heavier than the last. "No, no, no," he whispered under his breath, scanning every corner. Then he saw it, on the floor, beneath a fallen lamp, a piece of paper soaked at the edges by the rain dripping from the ceiling. He picked it up, hands shaking as his eyes read the words written in trembling ink. "I'm sorry, Dante." He took him. Isabella. His chest caved in, the paper trembling in his hand as thunder cracked overhead. For a long moment, he couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The room spun around him, every memory of her flooding back, the laughter, the promises, the way she used to touch his face when he was lost in rage and whisper, "Come back to me." And now she was gone. Again. His knees hit the floor, the gun clattering beside him, his reflection in the puddle of rainwater a stranger's, haunted, broken, drowning in ghosts. The candle flickered weakly beside the note, its flame shaking like his resolve. He reached out, tracing her handwriting, and whispered her name like a prayer that no longer had meaning. Isabella. He tried to piece it together, the fragments of betrayal and love colliding in his mind. Had she run to save their child, or had she delivered him to Lorenzo? The thought burned him alive. The baby's cry, the look in her eyes, the way she'd said "You were never supposed to find us," it all twisted inside him now, impossible to separate truth from deception. He slammed his fist into the floor, the echo like thunder in the hollow mansion. "Lorenzo!" he roared, his voice breaking the silence, filled with fury and heartbreak. The walls seemed to answer back with their own moan, a creak deep within the structure as if the house itself mourned. Outside, the storm reached its peak, lightning setting the sky ablaze while thunder swallowed his cries. Dante stood slowly, his face wet with a mix of rain and tears, his shoulders trembling but his eyes turning to steel. He looked down at the note again, folding it carefully and tucking it into his jacket, the motion deliberate, ritualistic. "You can take my empire," he whispered to the empty room, "but if you touch what's mine, I'll burn the world for you." The lights flickered once more, then went out completely, plunging the mansion back into darkness. Somewhere deep inside the walls, a faint echo of a baby's cry returned, distant, haunting. Like the sound of his own heart breaking, the storm had begun to fade. But inside the mansion, chaos still breathed. Dante stood in the wreckage of the safe room, the paper in his hand damp and trembling, its ink smudging like a bleeding wound. His chest felt hollow, his thoughts splintering under the weight of the silence Isabella left behind. Every instinct screamed to destroy something, to tear the walls apart until he found her, but beneath the fury, something colder pulsed, control, that deadly kind of calm that once made his enemies tremble. He holstered his gun, straightened, and walked toward the main hall. The mansion moaned under the storm's retreat, the rain easing into a whisper against shattered windows, but the wind that came through still smelled like smoke, betrayal, and the ghost of her perfume. He could still hear her voice in fragments, "You were never supposed to find out the truth." It repeated like a curse. He stepped over the bodies of two of Lorenzo's men in the hall, their eyes glassy, their blood pooling into the cracks of the marble, and yet Dante barely looked down. He moved like a phantom through his own home, the echo of his footsteps chasing him, his reflection fractured in the broken mirrors along the corridor. He reached the study, where the old surveillance hub still flickered weakly. Most of the feeds were dead, but one camera, the one facing the south road, blinked to life. Static cleared for a moment, and through the fog and rain he saw taillights disappearing down the dirt path that led to the old Romano chapel. Dante leaned closer, jaw tightening. That road hadn't been used in years, not since the fire that almost took him. He reached for his radio, switching the frequency to the one only his most trusted men would recognize, the few who had stayed loyal after his supposed death. "Matteo," he hissed into the mic, "get me eyes on the chapel road. Now." There was a pause, static, then a gravelly voice. "Boss? Is that? Holy hell, Dante, everyone thought you." "No time," Dante snapped. "Lorenzo's taken them. Track his convoy, 3 cars, dark SUVs. Find out where they stop." He tossed the radio aside and stared at the last flicker of the screen until it went black again, taking with it the last thread of control he had left. The mansion felt colder without the hum of electricity, like it was grieving along with him. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the portraits on the wall, his parents, gone too soon, Lorenzo standing beside him in their youth, both of them wearing the same smile that now disgusted him. He tore the frame down, glass shattering across the floor, the sound loud in the emptiness. "You were supposed to protect family," he muttered, voice shaking, his breath ragged. "Not hunt it." For a moment, he leaned against the desk, closing his eyes. And in the darkness behind them he saw Isabella again, the way she'd looked when he first met her. Barefoot in the garden, laughing like she didn't know who he was. The sound of her laughter was now replaced by the echo of gunfire and the cry of a stolen child. His child. That thought burned him alive. He opened his eyes, the softness gone, only the soldier left. He checked his gun, loaded another clip, then opened the hidden cabinet behind the bookshelf. Inside were the relics of his old life, 2 pistols, a combat knife, a folded black coat, and a chain with the Romano crest, a symbol he'd sworn never to wear again. He slipped it over his neck, feeling the cold metal press against his skin, grounding him in the madness. As he fastened the last button of his coat, the sound of distant thunder rolled again, faint, lingering, like the earth itself was warning him of what came next. He ignored it. He grabbed the car keys from the drawer, his movements sharp, efficient, but every motion carried the ghost of her touch, the warmth of the child he'd never held. He stepped into the hall again, passing the grand staircase where she once waited for him in silks and laughter, now littered with shell casings and blood. He paused there, his eyes rising toward the second floor where her scent still lingered faintly, as if she might walk out from one of those doors and call his name. But ghosts don't return twice. He descended the steps and pushed through the main doors, into the damp night. The storm had quieted, but the air still hummed with tension. Lightning flashed once over the horizon, illuminating the long road ahead. Dante's car sat waiting beneath the dripping archway, its paint scarred and rusted from years of neglect, yet the engine roared to life like it recognized its master. He slid behind the wheel, tossed the note onto the passenger seat, and stared at it for a long moment before speaking softly, to no one and everyone. "I'll find you, Isabella. Even if I have to kill my own blood to do it." The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying his words into the darkness as he slammed his foot on the gas. Gravel spit from the tires, the mansion shrinking behind him, a corpse of memories burning in his rearview mirror. The road ahead twisted through the valley, the chapel's shadow barely visible in the distance, but Dante didn't slow. He didn't blink. His hand brushed the crest around his neck, and his voice, barely above a whisper, broke through the hum of the engine. "Lorenzo," he said, his tone low and final, "you wanted the bloodline? You're about to drown in it." And with that, he disappeared into the night, chasing thunder, chasing ghosts. Chasing the last piece of his heart that had been stolen by the only woman he'd ever loved. The docks appeared like a scar carved into the coastline, rusted cranes leaning against the night sky. The scent of salt and old blood lingering in the damp air. Dante's car screeched to a halt beside the broken pier, its headlights slicing through the fog that rolled off the black water like smoke from hell itself. He stepped out into the cold wind, his coat whipping behind him, the sound of distant waves crashing against the wooden pylons echoing like dying heartbeats. The Romano docks, once the beating heart of his empire, were now nothing more than a graveyard of ghosts and betrayal. He remembered the nights he and Lorenzo stood here as boys, throwing stones into the water and making promises they never kept. Now those promises had turned to bullets. Dante moved silently through the shadows, his boots crunching over shards of glass and discarded shell casings that glimmered faintly under the pale moonlight. Ahead, the old warehouse loomed, half collapsed but still guarded by a handful of Lorenzo's men. Their silhouettes shifted near the entrance, smoke curling from their cigarettes. Dante crouched behind a stack of crates, loading his gun with calm precision, his breath steady despite the storm inside him. The echo of the baby's cry from the mansion still haunted him, driving every motion, every heartbeat. He could almost feel the warmth of his son's tiny hand that he'd never held, a hand Lorenzo now used as a weapon. The rage in him simmered quietly, not wild and reckless, but focused, like the eye of a storm moments before it breaks. One of the guards turned toward the pier, squinting into the fog, and in that instant Dante moved. Two silenced shots cut through the air, swift and merciless. The bodies fell before they could even exhale. He dragged them aside, stepped over the threshold, and pushed the heavy metal door open. The smell hit him first: oil, gunpowder, and something faintly floral beneath it. Her perfume. He froze, the ghost of a heartbeat fluttering in his chest, and then he heard voices. Lorenzo's smooth, mocking tone carried through the cavernous space. "You've always been too sentimental, brother. That's why you lost everything." Dante slipped behind the machinery, eyes narrowing as he caught sight of them in the faint light filtering through the broken windows. Lorenzo stood near the center of the room, his suit immaculate despite the grime, his pistol gleaming in the glow of a hanging lamp. And beside him, Isabella. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, her arms wrapped around the child as if she could shield him from the darkness closing in. When her eyes met Dante's across the room, something inside him cracked open: relief, pain, and fury all at once. Lorenzo noticed the shift in her gaze and smirked, lifting his gun lazily toward her temple. "Ah, he's here," he said softly, his voice curling with satisfaction. "The ghost returns to reclaim his sins." Dante stepped out from behind the shadows, his weapon raised, every muscle in his body coiled like a loaded spring. "Let them go, Lorenzo," he said, his voice low, steady, deadly calm. "You want me? I'm right here." Lorenzo laughed, not loud, but cruel and hollow, the kind of sound that belonged to someone who had already died inside. "Always the martyr," he sneered. "But you see, brother, this isn't about you anymore. This is about what comes after us. About the blood that carries our curse." His eyes flicked toward the baby, who whimpered softly against Isabella's chest. "He doesn't deserve this," Dante growled. "He's innocent." "No one born of this name is innocent," Lorenzo shot back, stepping closer to Isabella, the gun unwavering. "You ran from the Romano throne, left me to clean the mess you made. And now you crawl back because of a woman you should have let burn." The words hit like bullets, but Dante didn't flinch. His finger tightened around the trigger, the world narrowing to the space between them: two brothers, two guns, one heartbeat away from the end. "You took everything from me," Dante said. "But you will not take them." Lorenzo tilted his head, a cruel smile curving his lips. "Them," he echoed softly. "You still don't get it, do you?" He turned the pistol away from Dante, aiming it at Isabella instead. "Love makes you weak. Time fractured." Dante's heart slammed against his ribs. "Lorenzo, don't." Isabella's voice broke the air, trembling and raw. "Please, don't do this. He's your brother." "No," Lorenzo murmured, he stopped being that the moment he chose her. The baby cried again, louder this time, the sound slicing through the tension like glass breaking. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The wind rattled the windows, the sea roared beyond the walls, and then, the world exploded. A single gunshot shattered the silence, followed by the echoing scream of steel against stone. Smoke filled the warehouse, the acrid scent of gunpowder burning Dante's throat as his vision blurred. The sound of something heavy falling, a cry cut short, and then, silence. Dante's knees buckled, his gun clattering to the floor as the smoke drifted around him, wrapping everything in gray uncertainty. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. Only the baby's faint whimper cut through the fog. His hand reached out blindly, trembling, his heart pounding in his ears. Somewhere in the haze, a shadow moved, a figure collapsing, another standing still. Dante froze. His pulse stopped. Someone had pulled the trigger. But who was still standing? The world seemed to stop breathing. Smoke curled upward in trembling ribbons, twisting through the broken beams of light cutting across the warehouse floor. And Dante stood in the middle of it all, frozen, deafened by the echo of the gunshot still ringing in his skull. The smell of burnt powder clawed at his throat as he blinked through the haze, his pulse hammering like a war drum. Somewhere near the center, a shadow shifted, slow, weak, collapsing. He staggered forward, his boots scraping against shattered glass and blood-slick concrete, the metallic scent thick in the air. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice raw, cracking on her name as he reached out blindly through the fog. The smoke parted just enough for him to see her silhouette, crumpled on the floor beside a wooden crate, her arms still wrapped around the child, her body trembling as though she were fighting to stay conscious. Dante's knees hit the ground before he even realized he'd fallen. He pulled her into his arms, the world narrowing to her face, pale, tear-streaked, a line of crimson tracing down her shoulder where the bullet had grazed her. Her breath hitched, shallow but there, and that alone was enough to make his heart twist. "You're okay," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers, his voice breaking with a mix of rage and relief. "You're okay, Bella." She tried to speak, but only a soft sound escaped, not words, just the faint cry of a soul too tired to explain the pain it carried. Behind them, the faint creak of boots echoed. Dante turned, his body tightening like a coil, gun raised again. Through the thinning smoke, Lorenzo emerged, limping, his hand pressed to his side, blood seeping through his expensive suit. His eyes gleamed, feverish and wild, the madness of years written across his face. "You think you've won," Lorenzo rasped, a bitter smile splitting his mouth. "You always think you can save everyone." He stumbled forward, the gun in his hand trembling but still aimed at them. Dante stood, placing himself between Isabella and the barrel, his voice low and venomous. "You should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "The shadows? You made me this. You left me with an empire you were too weak to control. I cleaned your blood, buried your mistakes, watched the men you trusted betray me one by one. And you know what I learned, brother? Mercy is a disease." His finger twitched against the trigger, but before he could fire, the baby began to cry again, a soft, fragile wail that shattered the air like lightning splitting a storm. The sound froze Lorenzo mid-motion. His eyes flicked toward the child, and for the briefest second, Dante saw something human flicker there, hesitation, sorrow, maybe even guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that hollow fury that had devoured him from within. "He's mine," Lorenzo whispered, almost reverently. "My legacy, not yours. You abandoned everything. You don't deserve to carry the Romano name." Dante's jaw tightened, his voice dropping to a growl. "You're right," he said. "I don't deserve the name, but he does. And I'll burn this world before I let you touch him." The next moment erupted in motion, Lorenzo fired, Dante dove, the bullet ricocheting off a steel beam inches from his head. He rolled behind a crate, returning fire, each shot a roar of vengeance and memory. Sparks flew, wood splintered, glass shattered under the chaos. Isabella screamed, clutching the baby tighter as she crawled toward cover. Dante's gun clicked empty, but he didn't stop. He lunged from behind the crate, tackling Lorenzo to the ground. The impact sent them crashing into a pile of old cargo nets, fists flying, blood smearing across the floor. "You think you're saving him?" Lorenzo snarled, striking Dante across the face. "You're just giving him another curse to carry." Dante's knuckles cracked against his brother's jaw, sending blood spraying across the concrete. "Then I'll carry it for him," he growled. They grappled, each movement filled with years of buried hatred, of love twisted into something monstrous. The storm outside raged again, thunder rolling across the sea as if the heavens themselves were watching their war. Finally, Dante pinned Lorenzo to the floor, his hand closing around the gun that had fallen beside them. He pressed the barrel against Lorenzo's chest, his breath ragged. Lorenzo looked up at him, his mouth curling into a faint, bloodied smile. "Go on," he whispered. "Finish it. You always were father's favorite." Dante hesitated, for 1 second. One heartbeat, seeing not the monster, but the brother he once knew. The boy who stood beside him at their mother's funeral. Who promised they'd always protect each other. That memory hit like a knife. His hand trembled. And in that flicker of weakness, Lorenzo's hand darted forward, clutching Dante's wrist, twisting the gun between them. The shot exploded. A flash. A scream. Dante fell back, his ears ringing, his vision blurring as he watched Lorenzo slump sideways, motionless. The smell of blood and smoke blended into something unreal, dreamlike. He crawled toward Isabella, his chest heaving, his hands shaking so violently he could barely reach her. She stared at him, wide-eyed, tears mixing with the dust on her cheeks. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice quivered as if even she didn't believe it. Dante wanted to answer, to tell her it was finally done, but the echo of the gunfire still clung to the air like a ghost refusing to leave. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of sirens began to rise, faint but growing closer. And as Dante held her hand, his eyes flickered toward Lorenzo's still body, blood pooling beneath him. Yet in the haze, a faint sound broke through, not sirens, not waves. Breathing. A weak, uneven breath coming from the darkness. Someone was still alive. The smoke thinned slowly, curling away from the broken beams as dawn began to bleed into the warehouse through shattered windows. The first light of morning fell across the blood-soaked floor, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson, the kind of cruel beauty only tragedy could create. Dante stood in the center of it all, his chest heaving, blood trickling from a gash above his ribs, his hands trembling as he held the baby against him. The little one was crying softly, face pressed to Dante's chest, but that sound, fragile, innocent, was the only thing keeping him from collapsing entirely. His body screamed in pain, his mind blurred by the chaos that had unfolded, but his heart clung to the tiny heartbeat he felt beneath his palm. He looked toward Lorenzo, sprawled across the floor, motionless, the gun beside him glinting faintly in the light. For a long time, Dante didn't move. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that comes after every storm, too still, too final. Then, a sound, a soft gasp. Dante turned, heart lurching, and saw Isabella struggling to rise. She was pale, her dress soaked in blood, her hand clutching her side, but her eyes, God, those eyes, still held that same warmth that once pulled him out of every darkness. He rushed to her, dropping beside her, setting the baby down carefully on a bundle of cloth. "Don't move," he whispered, pressing his hands over her wound, but she caught his wrist weakly, shaking her head. "It's nothing," she breathed, her lips trembling with a ghost of a smile. "He's safe now. That's all that matters." The way she said it, calm, certain, final, made something inside him shatter. "No," he said, voice breaking, "you're going to be okay. We'll get help. You'll see him grow. She touched his face with trembling fingers, silencing him. "You always tried to fight the world, Dante," she whispered, her voice fading like the tide pulling back from shore. "But some battles aren't meant to be won, only remembered." Her gaze drifted to the baby, her lips curving faintly. Tell him I loved him more than life itself." He wanted to scream, to refuse the words, but his throat burned and no sound came. The sunlight touched her face as her breathing slowed, each exhale softer than the last, until it stopped altogether. Dante's world went still. The wind outside shifted, carrying the scent of the sea through the shattered door, and in that moment, something inside him broke, not with anger, not with rage, but with a silence so deep it felt eternal. He pulled her close, his forehead pressed against hers, tears mixing with the blood between them. "You'll never be forgotten," he whispered. The sirens grew louder outside, blue and red lights flickering faintly through the fog, but Dante didn't move. He sat there, the baby crying softly beside him, until the world faded into blur and the sound of boots and shouting filled the room. And then, everything went dark. When Dante opened his eyes again, weeks had passed. The pain in his ribs was gone, the stitches had healed, but the ache in his heart remained, dull, constant, like a scar that refused to fade. He stood on the balcony of the rebuilt Romano mansion, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the cliffs, the morning breeze brushing through his hair. The empire he once ruled with fear and fire had become something else, quiet, empty, peaceful. In his arms, the baby slept, wrapped in a soft blanket, his tiny hands curled into fists as if ready to fight the world already. Dante smiled faintly, brushing a finger over the child's cheek. "You'll never know what we were," he murmured, voice low, tired but gentle. "You'll only know what we became." The wind carried the scent of roses from the garden below, her roses. He turned toward the small table beside the balcony door, where a single framed photograph rested, Isabella, her smile radiant, her eyes alive in a way memory could barely capture. Beside it, he placed a red rose, fresh from the garden, the petals trembling in the breeze. "I was a king built on fear," he said softly, the words barely more than a breath. "But you made me a father." For a moment, the world seemed to answer with silence, but then he heard it, her voice, not in sound but in memory, echoing through the chambers of his heart. "One day, Dante. You'll choose love over blood." He closed his eyes, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I finally did," he whispered. The baby stirred, letting out a tiny sigh, and Dante held him closer, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not victory, not revenge, but peace. The kind that comes when a man finally stops running from himself. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the sea, lighting the mansion with warmth instead of fire this time. The portraits of the Romanos had been taken down, replaced with open walls and light, and for the first time, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt alive. Dante looked out toward the horizon, the waves glittering like molten glass, and breathed in deeply, the salt and the air filling his lungs like absolution. Behind him, on the mantel inside, the Romano crest still hung, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of what it had cost. He had lost everything: his brother, his empire, the only woman he'd ever loved. But as he looked down at the small, sleeping face in his arms, he realized he had gained something far greater, a reason to live again. The evening sun began to dip behind the ocean, staining the horizon with golden fire. The sky bleeding into the same colors that once ruled Dante's life: passion, rage, and sacrifice. Yet tonight, they looked softer, calmer, as if the heavens themselves had forgiven him. The mansion stood silent behind him, the faint sound of waves colliding against the rocks below filling the space where once there had been shouting, gunfire, and ghosts. Now there was only the whisper of wind, the soft breath of a child sleeping, and the memory of a woman whose love had outlived her death. Dante sat on the balcony's edge, the sea breeze brushing through his hair, the baby resting peacefully in his arms. He could see the small rise and fall of the boy's chest, the rhythm of innocence that made time itself slow down. For years, Dante had lived in constant motion, chasing power, vengeance, shadows, but for the first time, he felt still, whole. The sun caught on the silver chain around his neck, the Romano crest glinting faintly in the dying light. Once, it was a mark of fear. Now it was a promise that his son would never grow beneath that same darkness. "Your name," he whispered quietly, looking down at the baby's face, "will mean something different." He thought for a moment, his lips curving faintly. "Adrian," he murmured. "Strong, like her. Gentle, like I never was." The baby stirred slightly, as if recognizing his name in a dream, and Dante smiled through the ache in his chest. He stood, carrying Adrian inside, the marble floors of the rebuilt mansion echoing softly beneath his steps. The halls were brighter now, filled with light that spilled through open windows instead of the cold gleam of chandeliers. Isabella's touches were everywhere: the lavender curtains she loved, the piano she once played, the garden she dreamed of planting. He had rebuilt everything not as it was, but as she would have wanted. Every flower, every wall, every quiet corner whispered her name. In the living room, a cradle stood by the fire, the flames crackling softly as if keeping watch. Dante laid Adrian down gently, brushing a hand over his son's tiny head before stepping back. His body still bore the scars of that night at the docks, thin lines across his ribs, a stiffness in his shoulder, but they no longer hurt. They reminded him that he had survived something far worse than bullets, himself. He turned toward the mantel above the fireplace where a few framed photographs stood, Isabella smiling beside a garden of roses. A picture of the old mansion before it fell to ruin. And one of Dante holding Adrian for the first time in the hospital days after the fight. His fingers brushed the glass of Isabella's photo, tracing her smile. His throat tightening as memories flooded back, the laughter, the fights, the quiet nights they'd spent in this very room when love still felt invincible. "You won, Bella," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You made me choose love over blood." The fire crackled in reply, a soft pop echoing through the stillness like an answer. He exhaled slowly, sitting down on the couch beside the cradle, his eyes drifting toward the window where the last light of sunset painted the world in gold. He remembered her last words, "He's safe now." And he finally understood what she meant. Safety wasn't about walls or weapons or power. It was about letting go of everything that poisoned the soul. The Romano Empire was gone, the throne destroyed, and yet Dante didn't feel loss, he felt release. He thought of Lorenzo for a moment, the boy he once loved like a shadow, the man he was forced to destroy. The ache of that blood still lingered, but beneath it was something quieter, almost forgiving. "Rest, brother," he whispered, his voice carrying into the quiet air. "It ends with me." The firelight flickered across his face, catching the faintest glint of tears he didn't bother to hide. He leaned back, exhaustion pulling at his body, but peace settling deep in his heart. The night crept in slowly, stars blooming above the sea like silent witnesses to his rebirth. The sound of waves blended with Adrian's soft breathing, the rhythm lulling him into stillness. For years, Dante had defined himself by the empire he built, by the fear he commanded, by the enemies who whispered his name with dread. But now, as the clock ticked softly on the mantel and the wind brushed gently against the open balcony doors, he realized his legacy was no longer written in blood. It was written in love, fragile, painful, eternal love. He stood once more, walked back to the balcony, and looked out over the dark ocean where the reflection of the moon shimmered like silver fire. He could almost see her there, standing in the surf, barefoot, smiling the way she used to, unafraid, free. The wind moved through him, carrying her scent, her voice, her promise. "One day, Dante, you'll choose love over blood." He smiled faintly, the first true smile in years, his voice barely a whisper. "I did, Bella. And it saved me." He turned back toward the cradle, where Adrian slept peacefully, a faint smile curving the baby's lips as if he somehow heard the words. Dante knelt beside him, kissed his forehead, and whispered one last vow, not as a boss, not as a sinner, but as a father. "Your world will be different, my son. You'll grow where love is stronger than fear." The fire dimmed, the stars brightened, and the sea outside sang softly against the cliffs. For the first time, the Romano mansion, once a kingdom of death, felt alive again. Dante looked up at the night sky, the weight of his past finally lifting from his shoulders. He closed his eyes, breathed in the peace he had earned, and let the world grow quiet around him. For a man who had lost everything, he had finally found something worth living for, and this time, it was enough.